Let's begin with a word of prayer this morning. Lord, we just pause again this morning to give you thanks that we can be here in your house. We know the circumstances aren't what we would have anticipated. The circumstances maybe aren't what we would have liked, but they didn't take you by surprise, and here we are again this morning, Lord. I want to thank you that you've gone before, you've prepared this time for us this morning. Thank you that by your Spirit you're at work in our hearts. And I just pray that as we share from your word, that you will take that and speak into our lives this morning. And so we want to commit the next moments into your hands for your wonderful name's sake. Amen. I have to admit that I don't like to acknowledge my weaknesses. In fact, I'll go to great lengths to try and cover my weaknesses. For example, if I have to speak at an event, I'll way over-prepare to try and hide the fact that by nature, I'm a shy introvert who's afraid of people. Now, I have a suspicion that probably I'm not the only one here this morning who may struggle with a similar kind of issue, struggling with our weaknesses. We're the kind of people who, if somebody asks us, well, how was your week? We'll say, fine, even if we've had the worst week in our life. We're always concerned about, putting our best foot forward, always concerned about, how we appear before others. And one of the traps that I just continually fall into, and I realized even this past week that it had happened to me again, is comparing myself with other people. How do I measure up with so-and-so? How do I appear in light of what they're doing? It's this comparison thing that we so often fall into. So the question I'd like us to reflect on this morning is, what is a biblical perspective on weakness? It's something that I've struggled with all my life. And how should I respond to weakness, to difficulty in my life? And to help us reflect a bit on this question, I'd like us to actually look at the life of the Apostle Paul. Now, as soon as I mention the Apostle Paul, I know going through your mind, some of you are going to say, the Apostle Paul, weakness? How can that be? Because, all you have to do is read the book of Acts. And I admit that when I read the book of Acts, I feel threatened and intimidated. Here's a man with vision, a man who God just turned around on the road to Damascus, saved in a dramatic fashion, and who just without fear preached the gospel. And so, Paul, weakness, is that possible? Well, one of the things I thank the Lord for, that tucked here and there through the New Testament, there's a few little passages where Paul opens a window to his heart and soul. And, and as we kind of look through that window, we realize that, yes, Paul is human. And one passage, for example, and I think personally it's one of the most poignant passages in all of the New Testament, it is one of the final passages that Paul ever wrote in his life. 2 Timothy chapter 4, the second half of 2 Timothy chapter 4. And if you recall, Paul was in a Roman prison. He was facing martyrdom. He knew that he only had a few months left in his life. And he writes to Timothy, 2 Timothy. And you get to verse 9 of chapter 4. And Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, make every effort to come. Make every effort to come. You see, Paul wanted Timothy at his side during those final moments, those final months of his life. And then he goes right on in the next verse, verse 10, and he says, Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me. Only Luke is with me. You see, Paul Paul was human. Paul struggled with loneliness. Paul struggled with rejection. He wanted Timothy at his side. And then as you go down through those final verses in 2 Timothy chapter 4, you get to verse 13, and he says to Timothy, Timothy, bring the cloak that I left at Troas. You see, it was fall. It was likely fall, and Paul was anticipating winter in a Roman prison. And he was anticipating the cold that he was going to be facing in that Roman prison. Timothy, bring the cloak that I left in Troas. And then you get right down to the end of the passage, and Paul ends the way he began. Timothy, make every effort to come before winter. Timothy, once we get into winter, it's going to be impossible to travel. And so I want you to be here before winter starts. Was Paul human? Yes. Did Paul struggle? Yes. And so I think there are a few passages that we can look at where Paul himself helps us understand, how would I deal with this issue of difficulty and weakness in my life? And I'd like us actually, the passage I'd like you to turn to this morning is 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And I want us to look at verses 7 through 10. And this is another passage where Paul opens his heart and gives us a little glimpse of his heart and soul as he struggles with a weakness in his life. And so let's read these verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we want to look at verses 7 through 10. And Paul writes to the church at Corinth, so to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardship, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, obviously, we need to put this passage in its context. And to actually understand the context, we need to go all the way back to chapter 10. And let me just see if I can quickly kind of run us through what comes before this passage so that we properly understand what Paul's talking about here. And if we go back to chapter 10, we'll find out that there's false teachers who have arrived in the church at Corinth. You see, Paul had planted the church in Corinth, and then he'd gone on to Ephesus to plant the church in Ephesus. But unfortunately, after Paul left, there were false teachers who came into the church and were teaching a different gospel than what Paul had preached. And in order to discredit Paul's ministry, they were actually criticizing Paul and saying, Paul wasn't really a true apostle like we are. And so Paul obviously heard about this, and so he writes to the Corinthians because he's concerned that the Corinthians are going to begin to doubt the gospel message that he had preached, salvation by faith and not by works. And so he's concerned they're going to begin to doubt about the ministry, the gospel that he had preached. And so he feels obligated to defend his ministry. So that's actually what Paul's doing in chapters 10 to 12 to a great extent, is defending his ministry. Now, he does it somewhat reluctantly, but he does it for the sake of the Corinthians. And so Paul starts in chapter 10, and one of the things that he reminds them is that he had God's authority as an apostle. So he said, that's where he starts in his defense. And then as he moves into chapter 11, he mentions about his lineage. And he says, just to remind you that I'm also a Hebrew, I'm also a son of Abraham. And you can kind of read between the lines. That's what the false teachers were claiming. Well, we're Jews, And so Paul says, well, I'm also a son of Abraham. And then you get down towards the end of chapter 11, and there's a paragraph there that I find very challenging, because Paul begins to talk a bit about the sufferings that he had faced in preaching the gospel. And you've probably read the list. I mean, Paul was imprisoned, and he was shipwrecked, and in hunger, and beaten on numerous occasions. What a challenging paragraph. And it's almost as if Paul was saying, surely sufferings qualify me as an apostle. But then there's one more thing that Paul wants to mention as we move into chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. And these are the verses that come just before the paragraph we just read. And Paul rather reluctantly talks about an unusual spiritual experience that God had given him. And how Paul had been taken up into the third heaven. And Paul had seen and heard things that you couldn't even express. And Paul had had this unusual spiritual experience. And so surely visions and revelations would qualify Paul as an apostle. So Paul's defending his apostleship through these chapters. And then we come to the paragraph we just read, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10, that we want to look at this morning. And Paul pauses for a moment just to kind of reflect for a few moments about this experience that he just described, this unusual spiritual experience. And probably what catches us off guard is that Paul says that God allowed a thorn in the flesh in my life. God allowed a weakness in Paul's life. And Paul was struggling with this weakness. And he talks to us in verses 7 to 10 a little bit about this struggle that he had with this weakness in his life. And I believe that Paul gives us three spiritual principles to help us get a biblical perspective on weakness, on struggle, on difficulty in our lives. And so I'd like us to delve into this passage in just a little bit more detail. And I'd like us to start by going back to verses 7 and 8. And so let's reread these two verses. So Paul again says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, and that's what he's just described in verses 1 through 6, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Now, over the years, scholars have literally spilled gallons of ink discussing Paul's thorn in the flesh. What was he talking about? And there's been all kinds of suggestions about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Some have suggested that, that Paul had a less than becoming appearance. Physically, he was challenged in that way. Others have suggested that he may have even had some kind of psychological issue that he struggled with. I'm not sure why they suggest that. For me, the most likely reason for Paul's thorn in the flesh could possibly go back to his first missionary journey that's described for us in Acts 13 and 14. And Paul, in his journeys, would have had to cross a swampy lowland in the southern part of Asia Minor. And it's suggested that Paul contracted malaria, and a malaria that was so severe that it had damaged his eyesight. And I think that's probably the most likely explanation for Paul's thorn in the flesh. But at the end of the day, we don't know what it was. But we do know that Paul struggled with his weakness, because he tells us in verse 8 that 3 times he asked God to take it out of his life. So we know that this weakness was something that Paul didn't want in his life. But as I read these first couple verses, what actually strikes me as Paul describes this experience is Paul's honesty and vulnerability. Because twice in verse 7, Paul says, to keep me from becoming conceited. To keep me from becoming conceited. And you see, as Paul struggled with this weakness in his life, he began to realize that God had a purpose for this weakness in his life. And you see, God realized that this very unusual spiritual experience that Paul had, that he describes in verses 1 through 6, could have become a source of pride in Paul's life. He could have become puffed up and said, I'm somebody special. I've had an experience that probably nobody else in the world has ever had. And so to keep Paul from becoming conceited, to keep Paul from becoming puffed up, God allowed a thorn in the flesh. God allowed a weakness in Paul's life. And I think that leads us to the first principle that I believe that Paul would share with us this morning in regard to a biblical perspective on weakness. And the principle would be this: that God uses my weakness, God often uses my weakness to sharpen my spiritual focus. God uses my weakness to sharpen my spiritual focus. I don't know about you, but I've realized that in my life's journey, if things are going fairly well, I tend to kind of put life on cruise control. And, just kind of cruising along and not too concerned about even spiritual things in my relationship with the Lord. And I realize that it can often be in those times when things are going fairly well that I tend to lose my spiritual intensity. But I think if there's something we learn from the Apostle Paul, it's that God is concerned enough about our spiritual life, our spiritual walk, that he will allow weakness in our lives in order to keep us on track spiritually. Now, just to be clear, God isn't a bully up in heaven that's just waiting to hit you and me on the head every time we make a mistake. But God does discipline our lives and brings us back to himself when we have a tendency to wander off. And it's interesting, this is exactly what happened in Paul's life. God allowed a weakness, God allowed a thorn in the flesh to keep him on track spiritually. There's verses in the Bible that I struggle with. And Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4 would be an example of a passage that I struggle with, because Paul, writing to the church at Rome, says the following. He says, "We rejoice in our sufferings." Let me just read that for you again. We rejoice in our sufferings. How is it possible for Paul to say that? Knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Rejoice in our sufferings. I wish it didn't have to be that way. But one of the truths of our Christian walk is that our roots grow deeper when we go through those difficult moments in life. That our spiritual intensity, our spiritual maturity is facilitated by those difficult moments in life. And that's the lesson that Paul would share with us this morning. God uses my weakness to sharpen my spiritual focus. God uses my weakness, those difficulties in my life, to sharpen my spiritual focus. But Paul goes on in these verses to continue to talk about this moment in his life, this thorn in the flesh, this weakness that he struggled with. And I'd like us to actually move into verse 9. But I want us to go back, just to give us a little bit of context, I want us to go back and read verse 8 and then into verse 9. And this is what Paul says in these two verses. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, and he's talking about the thorn in the flesh, that it should leave me. But he said to me, God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Three times, Paul asked God to take this thorn of the flesh out of his life. Now, I don't think this was just one of those sort of passing, momentary prayers, Lord, it'd be nice not to have to deal with this in my life kind of prayer. I think Paul really, he was pouring his heart out to God and said, Lord, please take this out of my life. I'm struggling with this. Please take it out of my life. 3 times, Paul asked God to take this thorn of the flesh out of his life, and 3 times, God said no. And God said, Paul, I'm not going to take this thorn in the flesh out of your life because I'm allowing it in your life for your spiritual good, to keep you on track spiritually. But my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. Paul, as you struggle with this weakness in your life, this situation in your life that you're struggling with, that's exactly the moment that you'll experience my grace. My grace is sufficient for you. And I believe this leads us to a second lesson that Paul would share with us to help us gain a biblical perspective on weakness, on difficulty, on struggle in our Christian life. The first lesson, God uses my weakness, God uses my difficulty, my struggle to sharpen my spiritual focus. But then secondly, God uses my weakness to unleash his grace. God uses my weakness to unleash his grace in my life. You know, my desire, and sometimes even my prayer over the years has been, Lord, take this problem out of my life. Lord, I'm facing this difficulty. Do something. Resolve it. Lord, somehow smooth over the pathway of life that's rough right at the moment. Or Lord, isn't there something you can do to sort of overcome this weakness in my life? But God's response is, no matter the difficulty, no matter the weakness, my grace continues to be sufficient for you. And God's response is, no matter how long you struggle with this in your life, my grace continues to be sufficient for you. And no matter the nature, no matter how difficult the struggle, God says, my grace continues to be sufficient for you. You know, I think there's an important spiritual principle that I have to understand at this point, and we see in Paul's life, and the reality is, God may not eliminate this difficulty out of my life. God may not eliminate the weakness I'm struggling with. But God promises to be present with me. And God promises at the point of my struggle to pour in his grace into my life. You know, Chuck Swindoll has this interesting definition of grace. And Chuck says, that God's grace is love that stoops. Love that stoops. I like that definition. You see, because it's in the moment of my extremity, when I'm struggling, is when God stoops down and touches my life. And God pours in the oil of his grace right at the point of my weakness, at the point of my struggle. Because you see, God uses my weakness to unleash his grace in my life. And sometimes it's in those moments that we get a glimpse of God's grace, maybe in ways that we don't always in day-to-day life. God uses my weakness to unleash his grace. And Paul continues on into verse 10 with another principle, I believe, about how do we get a biblical perspective on struggle, on weakness, on difficulty. And I'd like us to reread verse 9 and then move into verse 10 to pick up this third principle. But he, that's God, said to me, that's Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul's coming to a conclusion here. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, with insult, with hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness. I struggle with that statement. Boast about my weakness? I mean, why would Paul ever come to that kind of conclusion? Boast about his weakness. Well, I'd like us to we've already read the verses, but let's just kind of go back and just kind of run our finger through these two verses again and just see if, how did Paul come to that kind of conclusion, boast about my weakness? Well, if we go back to verse 9, actually, God makes a statement, a very, very critical statement here to Paul, and he says, my grace is sufficient for you there's a reason coming here, my power is made perfect in weakness. My power is made perfect in weakness. And so in light of that spiritual principle, Paul responds in the second half of verse 9, and he says, therefore I boast all the more gladly about my weakness. And then there comes this little phrase, so that. There's a reason coming here. So that the power of Christ may rest upon me. In my weakness, the power of Christ can rest upon me. And then as we move down into verse 10, Paul reaches his conclusion. And right at the end of verse 10, he says, for the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness. Can you imagine this, content with weakness? And he goes on with a whole list, weakness and persecution, tribulation, difficulty. I'm content in this kind of situation. And why is that? And he gets right down to the end, for. Here comes another reason. For when I am weak, then I am strong. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I think there's an important spiritual principle that Paul is laying out here in these last couple verses that we just walked through. And it's simply this, that in my weakness, God's power is highlighted. You see, it's in my inability that God's ability becomes evident. Because it's not me, obviously. It's God. Now, I admit that that's a tough pill for me to swallow. But I think what Paul is reminding us this morning is that it's not about me, it's about God. See, it's not about me, it's not about my appearance, how I look, it's about God and God's power being highlighted in my life. And so the third lesson that Paul would share with us this morning, I believe there's a third lesson here that Paul would want us to learn. First of all, God uses my weakness to sharpen my spiritual focus. But then God uses my weakness to unleash His grace in my life. And the third principle that I think Paul would have us see this morning is that God uses my weakness to highlight His power. God uses my weakness to highlight His power. A number of years ago, I was sitting in theology class, and the prof was talking about Martin Luther. Now, we know Martin Luther as the person who nailed his 95 Thesis to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, and the person God used to start the Reformation back in the 1500s. We know Martin Luther as the person who preached justification by faith and not by works. It's by God's grace that we're saved. It's not by works. That's something Luther had really struggled with in his life as a priest. Always trying to find ways to justify himself in God's eyes. And he finally woke up to the fact that we're justified by faith, not by works. But the prof went on to talk about something else that was important in Luther's eyes. It was something called theology of the cross. And I was totally caught off guard. I never heard of this before. And there was one says, I was sitting there in class, there was one statement that sort of summarizes this theology of the cross that just sort of jumped off the page at me. And it goes like this. It was in Jesus Christ's greatest moment of weakness, when He's hanging on the cross, His greatest moment of weakness that He accomplishes His greatest work, our redemption. Let me just read that for us again. It was Jesus Christ's greatest moment of weakness that He accomplished His greatest work. You know, when I heard that statement, it was just like a nail was driven right into my heart. You know, because I expend so much energy trying to cover my weaknesses. And yet Martin Luther would remind us this morning that it's often in the midst of my weakness that God accomplishes His greatest work. You know, it's often in my inability that God accomplishes His greatest work. As Paul wrestled with this thorn in the flesh in his life, he came to the conclusion, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness. Now, I confess this morning, I'm a long ways from boasting about my weakness. A long ways from boasting about my weakness. You see, my tendency and my prayer would be to say to the Lord, Lord, just think how much more effective I would be if you would make me an extrovert instead of an introvert. But then God responds and says, Ken, it's in your moment of weakness that my power becomes evident. You see, it's in your moment of weakness that my power becomes evident. You know, you could have arrived at church this morning with a smile on your face. I mean, that's the way we're supposed to come to church, isn't it? Smile on our face, but maybe in your heart you're struggling. You know, it could be a circumstance. It could be a difficulty in life that you're going through. Or it could be just unfulfilled expectations. You know, life hasn't turned out the way you thought it was going to turn out. Or maybe you've run up against a weakness in your life that just won't go away. And you're struggling with that this morning. And I believe that Paul would share with us 3 truths to give us a biblical perspective on weakness, on difficulty, on struggle in our life. And the first truth, the first principle is that God uses my weakness to sharpen my spiritual focus. God uses my weakness to sharpen my spiritual focus, because the reality of the Christian life is that the roots go deeper in the midst of struggle and difficulty. The roots grow deeper in the midst of struggle and difficulty. But then there's a second principle that encourages my heart. And the second principle is God uses my weakness to unleash His grace. God uses my weakness to unleash His grace. You know, and I'm just eternally grateful that God doesn't abandon me. You know, God doesn't just leave me to my own resources. But even in the midst of my struggle, even in the midst of my weakness, when I don't understand, God pours in His grace. And it becomes a moment when I experience God's grace. And then the third principle that Paul would share with us this morning is God uses my weakness to highlight His power. God uses my weakness to highlight His power. And that's a tough one for my ego. But one of the things I have to continually be reminded of is the fact that, you know, it's not about me, it's about God. It's not about me, it's about God. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, you graciously give us these little passages in your word that help us to deal with our day-to-day Christian life and our struggle, our difficulty, our stumbling. And this morning, again, I just want to thank you for your Spirit that's in work in our hearts, how you pour in your grace in our moment of weakness and frailty into our lives. You take what we can't fix and use it to your glory. And I just give you thanks for that. I pray that as we move out into this coming week, that you'll just take these 3 principles and just weave them into the fabric of our lives, I pray. For your wonderful name's sake. Amen.